They told the newspapers only part of the story. The rest was buried, sealed in whispers, smothered under lace and coffin wood. But imagine this. A bride, radiant in white, collapses in front of God, her family, her future. The church echoes not with bells of joy, but with her choking gasp. The wine, it burns. And in that moment, every eye turns to her, none to the guest who watches from the pew, calm, deliberate, knowing the poison has done its work. That guest was her mother-in-law. You weren't supposed to know this. In 1841, Hartford's social elite closed ranks, and the local press silenced the truth. A calculated murder, dressed in the robes of respectability, hidden beneath scripture and ceremony. But when you dig into it, the rot spreads wider. Because this is not just the story of one poisoned bride, it is the story of power, of control, of the way old families twisted morality to preserve their bloodlines. What unfolded that autumn morning was not simply a tragedy. It was a ritual execution masked as holy union. Before we continue, listen carefully. I want you to subscribe, click the bell, and in the comments tell us the city and state you're watching from. Not because the algorithm demands it, but because engagement is the one thing they can't bury. Every time you speak the truth aloud, you pierce their silence. So anchor yourself here, because we are only beginning to descend. Hartford in 1841 was a city balanced on a knife's edge. Old money clung to its federal mansions while immigrant families flooded its alleys, bringing with them faith, hunger, and ambition. To the powerful, it was not just a demographic shift, it was an invasion. And those who sat on Prospect Street, like the formidable Eleanor Peaton, swore they would not let their legacy dissolve into the clamoring voices of the foreign poor. She had clawed her way up the ladder of privilege, and she would burn the rungs behind her before she let an Irish seamstress ascend by marrying her son. But here's the forbidden truth. History books call it jealousy, a simple crime of passion. That is a lie. What happened in Trinity Church was a demonstration, an execution of control disguised as chance misfortune. And if you look closely, you will see the same patterns in every institution that governs you today. You must understand, the poison was not prepared in a single night. It was distilled over decades, through class anxiety, whispered prejudice, and a society obsessed with appearances. Hartford in 1841 was no innocent town. It was a battleground between the established bloodlines who guarded their fortunes like holy relics, and the new waves of laborers who threatened to redefine what it meant to be American. Behind every parlor window, a war of identity smoldered, and at its center stood Eleanor Peaton. She was not born into privilege. She seized it. A merchant's daughter who had married above her station, Eleanor had watched as her husband's fortune elevated her into the ranks of Connecticut's elite. But wealth is never enough. True power requires exclusion, knowing not only who belongs, but who does not. And to Eleanor, the Irish were intruders, Catholics, strangers to the rituals of New England respectability, a shadow caste marked by accent, faith, and poverty. To marry into them was to contaminate the Peaton name. Think of it. For years, Eleanor polished her family into an emblem of refinement. Every dinner party, every charitable appearance, every gesture was a performance to cement her standing. And then, her son William returned from Yale with ideas of love that crossed those invisible boundaries. He saw grace and intelligence in Bridget O'Sullivan, a seamstress. But to Eleanor, he saw nothing but contamination. In her mind, this was not romance, it was betrayal, and betrayal must be punished. Here's what makes this story so dangerous. It reveals the machinery of psychological control that still cages men today. They tell you whom you may love, whom you may respect, whom you may accept. They wrap it in the language of tradition, morality, and family honor. But it is always about power. Eleanor's fury was not only personal, it was systemic. She was defending an arguos, invisible hierarchy built to preserve bloodlines, wealth, and the illusion of superiority. Now pause for a moment. Imagine the moment Eleanor first overheard her son say the words, "I love you, Bridget. I will marry you." To him, it was liberation. To her, it was war. That single phrase cracked the foundation of her entire empire, and she made her decision in that instant. If the system she lived for demanded blood, then blood it would have. And so the slow march toward October 13th began, not as a wedding, but as a sacrifice. Eleanor Peaton did not think of herself as a murderer. No, she thought of herself as a guardian. Guardians must be ruthless when legacies are at stake. In her mind, William was too young, too naive, too easily swayed by the shine in Bridget O'Sullivan's eyes. So she would do what every empire has done when threatened, eliminate the outsider. Not with rage, not with passion, but with precision. She studied Bridget the way a surgeon studies anatomy. Every smile, every movement, every attempt to charm her future mother-in-law. Bridget thought kindness could win her over. Eleanor responded with nods, polite words, measured warmth. But behind those steel-grey eyes, calculations unfolded. The girl was healthy, full of life, meaning her death had to look natural. A fainting spell, a heart weakened by excitement, a fragile constitution undone by the weight of marriage. Society would whisper, but society would accept. That is the first lesson of power. Never oppose directly when you can dissolve the threat silently. Through her late husband's business papers, Eleanor found the answer. Arsenic oxide, a fine white powder, tasteless, unseen in wine. It left its mark quickly, burning through the body like judgment itself. She obtained it through trusted channels, dressing her request in the language of industrial experiments. No one questioned her. No one suspected her. That is the second lesson. The more respectable the mask, the deadlier the hand beneath it. She rehearsed the act as though it were theatre. In her dressing mirror, she practiced the motion, how she would tilt the sachet, how her fingers would brush the rim of the chalice as though adjusting it, how her face would carry nothing but maternal composure. She calculated the dosage, enough to kill swiftly, but not so much as to arouse suspicion. She measured tragedy into half a teaspoon. And when she looked at herself, in the mirror, adorned in pearls and silk, she saw not guilt, but destiny. She believed she was preserving her family, just as rulers and priests across history have justified their cruelties. To Eleanor, Bridget was not a girl, she was an infection. Understand this. Poison has always been the weapon of the powerful. Kings, queens, and priests used it not only to kill, but to remind the living that death can arrive invisibly, elegantly, without warning. Eleanor was not innovating. She was imitating the very machinery of control that had ruled for centuries. So when the morning of October the 13th arrived, Eleanor was not nervous. She was ready. The church was her theatre, and the wedding was her trap. The morning of October the 13th, 1841, dawned crisp and bright over Hartford. The bells of Trinity Church tolled with the promise of matrimony, their sound rolling through the cobblestone streets like a blessing. But inside Eleanor Peaton's mind, it was not a blessing. It was a countdown. She woke before dawn, dressed with deliberate care in deep blue silk, fastened the pearl necklace her husband had once given her, and slipped the sachet of arsenic into the hidden pocket sewn into her gown, every movement precise, every detail rehearsed. The church was alive with flowers and ribbon, autumn colors of gold and crimson. The air smelled of incense and wax. Guests filled the pews, their whispers rising and falling like the low hum of an audience before the curtain lifts. They came to witness a union. They would leave having watched a slow execution. Eleanor moved among them with grace, her voice calm, her eyes sharp. She greeted Hartford's elite with perfect warmth, noting their polite smiles and hidden judgment at the Irish families in attendance. She saw Patrick O'Sullivan usher his children inside, proud, oblivious, dressed in clothes that strained his wages. Eleanor felt her lip curl at the spectacle. To her, this was not integration, it was invasion. paraded openly before God and society. Her attention drifted again and again to the silver chalice resting on the communion table. She had donated it herself as a wedding gift, its weight heavy with irony. It would carry not the wine of blessing, but the wine of death. In the vestry, the bottle waited, French vintage, dark and rich, chosen for its strong flavor, perfect for masking the poison. At the right moment, Eleanor would adjust the chalice, slip the powder into the blood-red liquid, and watch it dissolve like a prayer unanswered. Understand the depth of this performance. Weddings are rituals of union, symbols of continuity, the merging of two lines. Eleanor twisted the ritual, corrupted it. The wine of covenant became the wine of execution, and no one, neither priest nor guest nor bridegroom, saw the shadow curling through the sanctity of that moment. When the music began, heads turned to the doors as Bridget O'Sullivan appeared, radiant in white. Her veil shimmered in the morning light. Every face softened in admiration. Every heart lifted, except Eleanor's. Her heart remained cold, fixed, unwavering. She alone knew this was not a wedding march. It was a procession to sacrifice. The organ swelled, voices lifted, and Bridget walked the long aisle of Trinity Church. Every step echoed like the toll of a clock counting down. Guests leaned forward, whispering blessings, watching William beam with the pride of a man convinced love could conquer class, tradition, even blood. Only one face remained untouched by joy, Eleanor's. She had chosen her seat carefully, positioned where she could rise without drawing suspicion. To those around her, she looked every inch the dignified mother, a picture of composure. But inside, her mind ticked through each step of the performance. When the vows were spoken, when the prayers began, when the priest prepared the sacrament, that was her moment. The words of the ceremony rose into the vaulted ceiling, sacred, solemn, binding. To have and to hold, from this day forward. William's voice trembled with emotion. Bridget's eyes shone through her veil, glistening with tears. They spoke their oaths not just to each other, but to the very society Eleanor had sworn to preserve, and Eleanor's hand, hidden in her sleeve, brushed against the cool metal of the sachet. She did not tremble, she did not doubt. Then came the sacrament. The priest lifted the silver chalice, blessing the wine, the blood of covenant. He turned to set it on the altar. In that instant, Eleanor moved, gracefully, naturally. The motion looked like nothing more than an adjustment, the gesture of a pious woman ensuring the cup was steady, reverent. But in the space of a heartbeat, the powder slipped from her fingers, a pale stream that vanished into crimson. It dissolved instantly. No cloud, no trace, only a faint shimmer swallowed by the dark vintage. The chalice passed into the priest's hands once more. He raised it toward the couple, his voice solemn. Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant. William and Bridget bowed. Bridget, his fingers, delicate and pale, lifted the cup. For a breathless second, time froze. Eleanor watched her lips touch the rim. She watched the red wine pass into her mouth, down her throat, and she knew there was no turning back. What the congregation saw was a bride honoring tradition. What Eleanor saw was a body already dying. At first, nothing. Bridget lowered the chalice, lips stained with red, and handed it back with trembling reverence. The priest continued his blessing, his voice echoing through the nave. William reached for her hand, smiling with such open innocence that the congregation melted in admiration. To the guests, the scene was perfect. To Eleanor, it was victory disguised as grace. But then, subtle, a shift in Bridget's breathing, a faint furrow in her brow. Her hand, resting lightly in William's, stiffened. She blinked rapidly, as though the candlelight had grown suddenly too bright. The priest droned on, oblivious. The guests leaned closer, whispering. William, sensing something, turned to his bride. Bridget! His voice broke, the first crack in the illusion. She tried to answer. The words caught in her throat. Her lips parted, but only a hoarse gasp escaped. "The wine, it burns." And with that, the ceremony ruptured. Bridget staggered, clutching her chest. The chalice nearly toppled from the priest's hand as William caught her by the shoulders. Gasps tore through the congregation. Some rose to their feet. Others froze, eyes wide, unwilling to believe what they were witnessing. Eleanor remained still, perfectly composed. Her hands folded in her lap, her face fixed in maternal concern. Inside, however, she watched intently, like a scientist observing the flawless outcome of an experiment. The poison worked quickly, faster than she anticipated. Bridget's skin flushed, then drained pale, her body racked by spasms. Chaos spread through the church. Women shrieked, men rushed forward. The priest called for water, for aid. His composure shattered, but there was no aid. There was no remedy. Bridget collapsed in William's arms, gasping, choking, clawing at the air as though trying to grasp the life already slipping away. And in that sacred space, beneath the stained glass, before the altar, in front of God and Hartford's most powerful families, a wedding transformed into a deathbed. The symbolism was perfect. To Eleanor, it could not have been more fitting. The outsider who dared trespass into the Piton bloodline had been struck down not in an alley, not in secret, but in the very house of God. A warning to all who watched. Understand this. The true purpose of poison is not just to kill, it is to perform. To remind every witness that death can be woven into beauty, that power can cloak itself in ritual. Eleanor had not simply murdered Bridget. She had staged a public execution wrapped in velvet and scripture. Bridget's veil tore as she fell, her body twisting in William's arms. He cradled her against his chest, his voice cracking into cries that echoed against the stone walls. "Help her! Someone! Please!" His desperation tore through the church like a blade, shattering the solemnity of ritual. Guests surged forward, their finery a blur of lace and wool, but no one knew what to do. The priest, trembling, tried to offer prayers while others fumbled for smelling salts, for water, for anything to combat the unseen terror unraveling before them. But medicine in 1841 had no defense against arsenic. Bridget's breaths grew shorter, sharper. Her fingers clawed weakly at William's coat, eyes wide with panic, as though she realized in her final moments that this was no divine accident. It was design. Gasps turned to screams. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. A man fainted in the pews. The organist froze mid-hymn, leaving only Bridget's choking sobs to fill the sanctuary. A wedding had become a spectacle of death, witnessed by the city's most powerful families. And there, in the middle of the storm, sat Eleanor. Calm, composed. Her lips pressed into a thin line of sorrow, the mask of a grieving mother who appeared every bit as stricken as the rest. But her eyes, those steel-grey eyes, never left Bridget. She watched the spasms weaken, the flush fade, the final breath rattle from her throat. She had rehearsed this ending in her mind countless times, and now she saw it play out perfectly. William's sobs collapsed into guttural cries as he shook Bridget's lifeless body. His tears stained her dress, his words breaking into fragments of prayer and disbelief. "No, no, no, Bridget, stay with me." But she was gone, and in that moment, the promise of love that dared defy bloodlines lay broken on the altar steps. Understand this. Eleanor had orchestrated not just a death, but a message. In a city where whispers mattered more than laws, every guest would carry the same conclusion back to their homes, that the O'Sullivan name could never mingle with the Petons, that those who tried would meet ruin. It was not justice, it was not divine will, it was control. The church bells outside continued to toll, ignorant of the horror within, ringing out as though announcing a marriage. But what Hartford had just witnessed was something far older, far darker, a sacrifice. The church emptied in a storm of panic, the air still heavy with incense and death. Bridget's body was carried out, shrouded hastily in linen, her veil tangled like a noose around her neck. William followed in a daze, his face ashen, his cries hollowed into silence. He had entered Trinity Church a bridegroom. He left a widower before the ink on the registry dried. But in the hours that followed, something remarkable happened. Not justice, not inquiry, but silence. Hartford's elite moved quickly, decisively. A physician summoned from Main Street glanced at Bridget's body and muttered the expected words. Weak heart, fainting fit, tragic, but not uncommon. No mention of poison, no suspicion voiced. The conclusion was written before the examination began. And why? Because truth threatened too much. To admit foul play at the altar of Trinity Church would stain the city's most sacred space. To admit arsenic would invite scandal, investigation, gossip that could unravel reputations far beyond the Peaton family. Hartford's upper tier thrived on appearances, and appearances demanded that this was no murder, it was misfortune. So the story was crafted. Newspapers recorded the event in hushed tones. A young bride, overcome by the excitement of her wedding day, stricken suddenly by weakness of the heart. The narrative was repeated in parlors, in drawing rooms, in pews the following Sunday. And within a week, the horror had been repackaged as tragedy, neatly folded into the fabric of acceptable society. William, shattered, never remarried. His grief was interpreted as noble devotion, the mark of a sensitive soul scarred by loss. Eleanor played her role flawlessly, the grieving mother-in-law, offering tears in public, restraint in private. To question her was unthinkable. To suspect her was social suicide. Understand this. Cover-ups are not improvised. They are systemic. The essay, "Me hands that pour poison are the hands that control the narrative afterward." And it worked. No charges were filed. No suspicions recorded. Bridget O'Sullivan was buried, not only in earth, but in silence. And yet, silence is never perfect. Whispers lingered in Hartford's taverns, in the back rooms where the Irish gathered. They said Eleanor had hated Bridget, that her eyes burned with quiet fury whenever the girl spoke. They said no fainting bride convulsed like that, no weak heart burned with such agony. But whispers are powerless against polished respectability. The city chose its truth, and the truth chose Eleanor. William Peaton never recovered. In the weeks after the funeral, he wandered Hartford like a ghost, his once youthful face hollowed by grief. Neighbors spoke of him standing by Bridget's grave long after midnight, whispering to the stone, begging for answers. His friends from Yale tried to console him, urging him to move on, to remarry, to restore his future. He refused. His heart had been cut out in Trinity Church, and he carried that emptiness for the rest of his life. Some say he drank himself into an early death. Others claim he simply withered, a living monument to a love extinguished. For the O'Sullivans, the wound was different. Publicly, they bowed their heads, accepting the official narrative of tragedy. Privately, their rage burned. They knew Bridget had not been weak of heart. They knew she had been strong, vibrant, full of life. The story told by Hartford's newspapers was an insult to her memory. But what power did they have? Immigrants, laborers, Catholics, they had no voice in a city governed by old money. Their protests would be dismissed as bitterness, their suspicions ridiculed. And so their truth was confined to whispers passed down through generations. That Bridget had been killed not by God's will, but by a woman's hand. Eleanor, meanwhile, emerged unscathed. Her standing in Hartford society only deepened. She became known for her composure in tragedy, praised for her dignity, admired for her strength. Invitations to her parlor increased. The very act of murder had elevated her stature. In silence, she had succeeded. Understand this. The real crime was not just Bridget's death. It was the way the system converted murder into morality. Eleanor's act was absorbed into the machinery of respectability, transformed into a cautionary tale that reinforced the social hierarchy. The lesson was clear. Outsiders who sought to cross class lines did so at their peril. The Peaton name remained intact. The old order endured. This is the genius and the horror of power. Violence is not always hidden in shadows. Sometimes it is performed in daylight, then erased in print. What matters is not the act, but the narrative that survives. Eleanor wrote hers flawlessly. And so the story of Bridget O'Sullivan's wedding day death faded from public memory, sealed away in the margins of history. But beneath that silence, the pattern remained, repeating itself across generations, across nations, across every system that values control over truth. You might be tempted to leave this story in the past, to dismiss it as a curiosity of Hartford's Gilded Age, a relic of superstition and old money cruelty, but to do so would be a mistake. Because what Eleanor Peaton did in 1841 was not unique. It was a template, and if you look around carefully, you will see the same ritual performed again and again in our own time. The details change. The arsenic is replaced with legal loopholes, with selective policing, with corporate contracts written in fine print. The church becomes a courtroom, a boardroom, a press conference podium. But the pattern remains the same. An outsider threatens the order, a challenger disrupts the hierarchy, and the system responds. Not openly, not honestly, but with performance. The crime is committed, the body falls, and then the narrative is rewritten until silence prevails. Think about the institutions you trust, the banks, the governments, the churches, the universities. How many scandals have you seen dissolve into silence? How many tragedies have been reframed as accidents, mismanagement, or isolated incidents? Every time the truth is buried under the language of respectability, just as Bridget's poisoning was buried under the story of a faint heart. This is the genius of control. Violence is not just physical, it is narrative. Eleanor's power did not end when Bridget collapsed. It began there. Because every witness left Trinity Church repeating the lie, every newspaper reinforced it, every silence validated it. And so the act of murder was not just an ending, it was a beginning, a recalibration of power. And here is where the descent reaches you, because if you think you are free of this machinery, you are already ensnared. You drink from the chalice every day, news headlines laced with half-truths, institutions presenting themselves as holy, respectable, benevolent. And like those guests, it's in 1841, you bow your head, you repeat the ritual, you walk away whispering the version of events you were given. Understand this, Eleanor Peaton is not gone. She is alive in every system that tells you what is acceptable, what is tragic but natural, what is unquestionable. Her hands are invisible now, but her method is eternal. So here we stand, at the end of the procession. The church is empty now, the candles long burned down. Bridget O'Sullivan lies in the ground, her name nearly erased, her truth smothered beneath Hartford's polished respectability. Eleanor Peaton sits immortal in the city's memory, not as a murderer, but as a woman of poise. And the guests, those who saw, those who whispered, carried their silence to their graves. But history is never silent. It bleeds through cracks. It murmurs in family stories. It waits for those willing to descend far enough to hear it. You have descended. You have seen the ritual stripped bare. And now you must ask yourself, how many chalices have you already drunk from? How many narratives have you accepted because they were easier than truth? Eleanor's lesson was simple. Power does not need to hide the body if it controls the story, and that lesson survives. It thrives in headlines that soften crimes, in institutions that bury accountability under ceremony, in leaders who poison not with arsenic, but with polished words. The machinery of control has only grown more subtle, more elegant, more pervasive. Understand this. What happened in Trinity Church on October the 13th, 1841, was not just a murder. It was a message, a demonstration of how truth can be strangled, how love can be erased, how control can be disguised as tradition. And that message still echoes in your laws, your news, your rituals, your silence. Do not look away. Do not dismiss this as a relic. The past is never past. It is a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. So here is the question I leave you with. When the chalice is raised before you, when the wine gleams dark and inviting, will you drink? Or will you recognize the taste of poison? Subscribe, click the bell, and tell me in the comments, do you see the pattern in your own city, in your own life? Because this is not just Hartford's story. It is yours. And the descent does not end here. It begins with you.